The homework go? Not bad. All right. So let's go ahead and look at that, and then we're going to, for our homework, look at augmenting that. But in order to do that, we need to learn how to move between multiple screens in our application. So let's start off with, we actually have just normal Xcode on here yet. Just click here, see if, for right now, just run this. All right, so we're going to go ahead and we're going to create a new application. We'll call this guy FibWatch. And this file put on the desktop. All right, and again, for those of you who are having problems getting the simulator to start, remember, always start off by clicking up here, going to your watchkit app, and choosing which simulator to use. I like to use the 6 plus the 38mm. Seems to load a little quicker, and on laptops it doesn't take up your entire screen and that kind of stuff. Okay, so for this assignment you were supposed to have a label and a button, and whenever you clicked on the label or clicked on the button, the label would update with the next Fibonacci number, correct? All right, so let's go to our watchkit app here and go to our interface storyboard. And let's go ahead and give ourselves, we're going to put a group in here. And we're going to say that this group is going to be a vertical group, so we can put a label and then a button below that. So we'll go ahead and put our label in here. And let's actually make this group. Actually, hold on a second. It's not the group, it's the label, right? Center the label, then we're going to drop the button below the label there. And we can make the label bigger if we should allow us to make it bigger. All right, and we'll center the text there in the label. And I'm going to go ahead and start it off at 0 because that'll be our first Fibonacci number, right? All right, so let's go ahead and run this real quick just to make sure our simulator and all that jazz is cooking. All right, so there's our initial interface. All right, so we need to do a couple of things. We need to have our IB outlet for this label. We need to have our IB action for this button. What's the difference between an IB outlet and an IB action? Go ahead.
Outlet doesn't allow you to change anything on the screen. Outlet it just displays it to the screen.
Okay. As opposed to an action. What does an action do?
Action allows you to actually click the button and change stuff.
Do you have to change something on the screen as a result of an action?
No.
So an action gives us the ability to deal with an event like a button click or something like that, but we don't actually have to manipulate our screen at all. We just do stuff behind the scenes. IB outlets give us what? Widgets on the screen, so it gives us programmatic access to widgets on our screen. So we're going to go ahead, I'm just going to click on our little yellow interface controller guy here to make sure the right code behind gets selected, and the code behind for this guy is our interface controller.swift file right here. All right, and we can prove that to ourselves if we click there and go over to this guy. It says this guy, interface controller, right there. It tells us which guy this belongs to. All right, So we're going to go ahead and click on the, what's this called, the assistant editor here, and it brings up our code right next to each other. And let me slide this out of the way, and we'll move this over a little bit. So we're going to go ahead and give ourselves an outlet for this label and give ourselves an action for this button so we can respond to stuff. So I'll do a control, click, and drag. And this is our outlet. So we're going to call this guy the label. So it puts that in there. And we'll do control, click, and drag. I guess we're going to put it there. Now, I can make an outlet for a button. I can also make an action for a button. Here I want to make an action, right? The default here is outlet. But I have both options for a button. I only had the option for an outlet for a label. When would I want to make an outlet for a button as opposed to do an action for a button?
I don't know if you're able to in action, but to be able to set the button text.
Yeah, change the title on the button, stuff like that, right? Change attributes associated with the actual button widget as opposed to respond to an event associated with the button. But in this case, we're going to respond to an event, and a button can have both an outlet and an action. Yeah. In fact, you can have a button can have multiple actions. All right. So we'll go ahead and create an action here associated with this button, and this guy is going to be called. Let's just call it button pressed. Okay. Make sure it says action. We'll go ahead and hit connect. That gets us there. Now, for right now, just to make sure our connection works, so that I know some of you ran into some issues where you were messing around with your labels, messing around with buttons, you deleted something, you re-added something, and sometimes what will happen is when you look at your connections here, you'll see sometimes there's a little exclamation point here, or you had something hooked up that no longer exists and your program is crashing. If your program's just randomly crashing for a reason that you can't come up with, check here first. Make sure that you don't have any, like if I delete this label right here, it'll still be hooked up to nothingness. I'll have this broken link over here that I haven't disconnected. Make sense? So things like that can make things go wonky, so it's kind of our first place to maybe check. Okay, so what we're going to do here is we're just going to go ahead, when we click on the button, I'm just going to change this label to say Z or blah. When we can say blah. Just proving that we have everything working through, all right, before we go and test our logic. A fairly common thing with any sort of MVC type programming is you're doing all this logic on the back end, and you assume your logic's not working when the reality is your interface isn't updating, that kind of stuff. So, typically make a habit of making sure that you have control over the label and that your button is calling the code you think it's calling before you start writing, life-changing code that you continue to change 30 times because you don't think it's working. Anybody have that experience with this assignment? I know at least 2 of you did. All right, so in any case, let's go into our code here, and we're going to work with there's our outlet that's up here, and here's our button pressed function. So whenever the button is pressed, we're just going to say self.thelabel.setText is equal to blah. All right, so now this guy should get called every single time that the button's pressed, and we'll just continually set it to blah. Go ahead and run this.
You said you could have multiple actions for one button.
Yeah.
So if you make another one and you say set text to woot, what?
Yeah, it would be they're going to get handled in an interesting order. It's a good question. I think they're handled linearly. So, well, let's try it. My my feeling is if we add the action now, it'll probably end up saying woot, the last one that changed. But I wonder if we actually will have control over which one changed. So let's just look real quick so we have our answer. So I'll go ahead and click here, click there. I'm going to go ahead and we're going to go from our button we're going to create an action. We're going to call button press 2, like that. And we'll go ahead and just steal the code from here. Make it say woot. So both of these guys are hooked up. They're both changing the same label, so it's going to be whichever one gets called last. My feeling would be that it's probably, if it's implemented like a stack, it'll say woot. If it's implemented, is that right? Blah, then it'll say woot. If it's implemented like a list and then goes through, it'll say, no, actually, if it's implemented like a stack, I think it'll say blah. It'll do the woot first, then do the blah. So the last thing it did would be blah. If it's implemented like a list, it'll do the blah first, and then move on to the woot, and it'll be left with woot. So let's see what the that's woot. So it does it in a linear order. All right. Probably not a great idea to do that stuff, but if you want two different events, two different actions to occur as a result of clicking the button, you know, maybe on one of them you change the label, maybe in the other one you update a database or something like that, and you want to kind of compartmentalize those in two separate functions, you can certainly do that. All right. Oh, that's not what I wanted to click. Let's click this. So now here, just to give you an example, since we already talked about this, I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to get rid of my IB action button press 2. All right, but now when I go back to my storyboard, you notice this guy's still connected to button press 2. Okay, he's still connected there, even though that connection no longer exists. Make sense? I did get rid of 2, right? Yep. Actually, hold on. Yeah, so let me back up here.
What? Oh, you had to have. How else would it...
We assumed it was, no, it overwrote woot. Let's see if it does. Maybe this guy doesn't let you have 2 hooked up. You can on iPhone. Let's check this out. So we have those guys back. Let's just disconnect everything. So here's our button press 2. So we'll hook button pressed up to this guy. We'll hit button press 2 up to this guy. Oh, only that you have it hooked up to 1. Wonder why. Well, I guess whatever. There's your answer. All right. So let's make sure that things aren't improperly hooked up now. But at the very least, you saw that even though we got rid of button press 2, it was still hooked up to something called button press 2, and that would have caused our code to crash, okay? So I'll go ahead and hook button pressed back up. So we're back in business now. Go ahead and run this real quick. Just make sure it still says blah. Like that. Okay. So now, every single time we press our button, we want it to change its value in some interesting way, right? What I want to do today is I want to talk about how do we go from one screen to another screen and get information from that first screen to the second screen. Okay? So the starting point here is I'm going to create another screen. So we're going to go ahead in here, we're going to take our interface controller, pop it out there.
So just doing a new interface controller creates a new...
Yep, just drag it out here. Yep, just drag it out there. Except right now we have no way of getting to this guy. All right, so what I'm going to do is I'm just going to control click on this button over here. And we have 2 ways that we can make this guy show up. One is a push, one is a modal. So push assumes that our interface is built as a stack of interfaces. On the iPhone side of things, this is called a navigation controller. On the Apple Watch side of things, it's just the default way of handling things. Okay, so whatever view controller is on the top of the stack, or in our case, whatever interface controller is on the top of the stack is the one we currently see. So when we push this second controller on top of the first stack, it's the new guy we actually see. Okay, when we pop it off the top of that stack, the previous guy is the one we see. All right, so that's one way we can, it says action segue, that's one way that we can move from one screen to another. The other one's called a modal display. What this does, it'll slide up onto the screen, so it's really just overlaying it on the current screen. It's not adding something new to our navigation controller. So you lose access to this. With a navigation controller, if you have an Apple Watch, you'll see that there's like a back button that gets built into that. We'll see this here. If you do this modally, you won't see the back button. All right, so we'll look at them both here. Let's start off with push, and then what I'll do is I'm going to go ahead and I'll throw a group in here. We're going to make this group vertical. We'll go ahead and throw a label in here. We're going to make the label centered, and let's make it just bigger, and then let's center the text on there. All right, so for right now we'll just have this guy say page 2. Let's change it, so we'll say page 2, and we'll go ahead and we'll run this. I'm on the first page. When I hit the button, it goes to page 2. I think we saw that if I hit, see how I have the back arrow now up here? So I can click on this guy, it goes back here. Actually, that's interesting. Are we still saying blah? We are, but the segue happened. Okay. So this takes me to 2. This takes me back. Something occurs here called a segue. Okay, which is our opportunity, just like last time we talked about having the ability to interject at the different points in time that a view controller is coming into existence or about to show up, things like that. Segues are our opportunity to interject something in the moment that a second thing is about to show up. All right, so let's kind of look at those right now. Because what's happening here is we're no longer calling that IB action. That IB action is now disconnected because we put in this segue to go from this button. The action of this button goes here, no longer to that IB action. Let's see if the IB action is still set up. Yeah, it's not. It's set up to the interface controller. Actually, no, it is still set up to button pressed. But it's a timing thing. It's doing the segue first. And let's prove that. So I'm going to leave it hooked up like we have it here. I'm going to go ahead into my code here. And just to prove it to ourselves, let's just do a print here. So every single time button press gets called, we'll say here to the console down here. Go ahead and pop the console up. Let's go ahead and run this. And let's see if we still get inside button pressed or if it completely omits that because it's doing that segue. And then I'll show you how to access that segue. All right, so I already moved there. Let's look at our console here. There's no here. So it's when we hooked it up as a segue, it's completely omitting calling that normal action. Its new action is the segue. All right, so that means that we need to still be able to do this crap, but we can't do it inside here. We get, as we've already seen, we get one opportunity at an action associated with a button, which is different than iPhone and iPad. iPad, you can have multiple actions associated with the same, multiple IB actions associated with it. So there's a built-in function. I'm actually going to show you the function. Well, let's just put it in here first. So it's override. I think it's context for segue with identifier. Is that it? That's the receiving one. just get the name of it real quick. It is that is it. That is it. All right, so we're going to say context. So override context for segue with identifier, and this guy's going to ultimately return any object. We can also return an array here, but let's just start off with returning any object for right now. Now before we explore this at all, let's just change our print to be right here. All right, so this should get called automatically when we make that transition to the segue. I do need to return nil here because it's this guy is expecting me to return an object. We'll talk about what any object is here in a second. I did return a value. There. Shut up and be happy. All right, so we're just going to print proving that we got into this code. All right, so let's go ahead and run this.
So button pressed isn't happening.
Correct. Yeah, we proved that button press wasn't happening because we never saw the here, but we do see this here. Okay, so this seems to be consistent with the idea that we can only have one action associated with a watchkit widget. All right, so even though we had this button press, that guy is superseded by our segue action that was automatically created when we did this, when we control clicked from here to here, to take us between these pages. Now, we might want something to happen as we're going from this page to this page. Make sense? That segue is our opportunity to interject in the middle before we get to that second page. All right, so I might want to pass something to this page. Maybe instead of this label saying page 2, we want it to say something else. Make sense? All right, so what we're going to do here, let's go over, let's see, I need to look at the receiving side of this guy. All right, that's the init. Okay, so I'm going to go ahead just so we can prove how this gets sent over here. I'm sending the message blah right now, right? So I have a very stupid context for segue with identifier thing. So I'm going to be getting this identifier. So the segue identifier is going to come from, let's see, it should be associated with, is it going to be the view controller? It should be this guy. Or is it associated with the button? Let's see what prints out here. So rather than printing here, let's print out segue identifier. Or sequence type, whatever. All right, so segue identifier, this is the value that was automatically passed in as a parameter to this function. So that's going to hold some value. Let's just see what it prints out. All right, that'll give us some indication on where we can set that if we're interested. Segue 3WY-I3-Q7C. Well, obviously, okay. Well, so making the assumption that we could figure out where that is set, that segue identifier is set. Actually, you know what? I bet you it's associated with the specific segue itself, which is this guy right here, segue identifier. Let's change that to woot. Clearly Did I click? Maybe I didn't click on the right guy. What is the identifier, isn't it? Let's disconnect the button press thing since we're not using that anymore. Let's click on that guy. That does say woot. Well, it seems like that should probably output woot. There we go. Maybe I didn't press enter when I hit the button, or maybe it had something to do with the other thing. But in any case, why do you suspect that we might want to use the segue identifier? Why is this being passed in?
So that you're able to pass things to the next screen.
This is passing to this screen. So this guy we're printing off still on this screen, the screen we're currently on. This guy is our way of getting stuff to the next screen. The value we return is ultimately going to get spit over to the next screen. And let me just show that to you real quick. So I'm going to come into, I can't show it. Let me still show it to you real quick, but let me remember my question. Don't let me forget it because it's an important one. I'm going to go ahead and we need to create, this is our MVC, right? We need to create a code behind for our second screen. That make sense? When we created our first app, it came with that interface controller.swift file. It came with our original code behind for our first interface. Well, now we've through our storyboard created a second interface, this guy right here, but we haven't connected a code behind to it yet. If I click on this guy and we come over to this guy right here, notice that the class that he's associated with is the WK interface controller. That is, hi, I'm a generic interface controller from watchkit. Not this guy who actually is part of class interface controller, which is this dude right here, who is a WK interface controller. All right, so this class interface controller.swift might as well be called elephant.swift, but he happens to be an instance of WK interface controller. So he acts like a WK interface controller, but then we can do extra crap that's special to this guy, like this kind of stuff. Make sense? Whereas our second dude here, this guy right here, he doesn't have a specialty dude behind him. He's like, okay, I am a WK interface controller, but nobody's attached a specialty version of that to me, so I'm just going to use the one that's provided by the language framework, and let's just hope it does everything that you want it to do. It won't, but let's hope. Kind of makes sense how that's going to work? So we need to create our own if we want this second screen to be interactive at all. If we wanted to do stuff, we can't rely on Apple having foreknowledge, even though Apple, I think, claims time travel, at least in the new watch, but they claim to know what they think we're going to want to do with our devices, but whatever.
So if I wanted that button to take me to just a picture, would it be reasonable to not hook it up to?
Absolutely, yeah, because you could add that image to this guy. Yeah, you can add an image. So if you're not going to do any logic behind, then we don't have to fully implement the MVC model. You're right. That's a good point. But we're going to go ahead and create one. So I'm going to come into our the folder here that says FibWatch, WatchKit extension thing. So same folder that our interface controller.swift's in for right now. Don't worry about why for right now. That's just where we're going to put our crap for right now before we start talking about the different types of interfaces that we can put on our watch. For right now, they're all interface controllers. So I'll right click there. We're going to say new file. Okay, this file is going to be watchOS file. And we're going to make this guy a watchkit class file. So we'll hit next. The default's going to be NS object. We're actually going to use here in a few minutes, but we're going to make this guy a WK interface controller. Okay, we want him to be a specialty version. And let's just call this guy page 2 for the class name. And make sure the language is Swift. All right, so we're going to call him page 2. He's going to be a subclass of WK interface controller. and he's going to be Swift. So we'll go ahead and hit next. This guy all gets set up. We're adding this to our watchkit extension. Actually, it should be our watchkit app, not the extension.
The interface controller's in the extension, the original one.
It's in that folder, but it should be part of our watchkit app. Well, let's test this real quick. I think it should be our app. Huh?
I got a second page up here. If you hit the assistant editor and click on the second page, it goes to that.
Okay. Well, let's leave it as the default then. But let me look into that. So this was the default. Just said watchkit extension. And what I really want to do here, so inside of page 2, Swift, which it put down here, I could probably drag it up here if I wanted to. I'm going to go here and inside the, oh, is it going to be awake? Yeah, this is fine. The awake with context, so this is when this guy is originally born, it gets this any object called context. I'm going to print that out. So I'm going to print context as a string. I'm pretty sure this should be that string blah that we passed in. So over here, we returned blah from our context for segue with identifier. We returned blah. Blah should come in as the context when this guy we have our first opportunity to work with this guy. All right, and I'm going to convert him to a string. That's what this as exclamation point means. So I'm saying, trust me, he's a string. Why? Because over here, I returned a string. And we're just going to print that out. So the hope is that when we hit the button, it goes to our context segue. Our context segue is going to print out woot to the screen because that's the name of this segue. Then we return blah. Blah is then received through the awake with context on the second page, and he prints that out. So there's woot. I want to find out if this guy ever got called. I don't think he did.
I couldn't get my awake with context to work like that either. I had to put it in the will activate.
Well, but this guy should get called. So I forgot one very important step. So remember when we first created this guy here, and we mentioned this guy was just a generic WK interface controller? And then we created another class to actually be his code behind. We kind of got to tell this guy that he has a new code behind. All right, so we're gonna go in here, and so we'll click on the yellow interface controller thing there, and for his class, which is on, it's in this icon right here, which is called what, the identity inspector. We'll click the drop down and we're going to choose page 2. That's the animal he is. It's page 2. All right. So now let's hit play. There's our button. There's our woot. There's our blah. Proving we were able to pass that information through. Make sense? All right. So now, we are able to send one bit of information from the first screen to the second screen. But notice this guy can return any object. Any object. So an any object is a generic form for, guess what? Any object. This could be a string. This could be an object that we create called a cat or a dog, where we can put 30 things in there, stuff like that. But for right now, we're just going to want to be able to pass one piece of information over to that second screen. Okay? Now, getting back to my other question, where I asked, why is it important for us to have access to the segue identifier on that first screen. When we click that button and it calls the context for segue with identifier, why is it important that we have the name of the segue, the identifier of that segue?
So you know what screen you're going to?
We don't know what screen we're going to, even in here. Even in here, we don't know what screen we're going to. We just know we're going to another screen, and this is the guy we're going to send there, right? How many times do you suspect that method can exist in our code? Once. How many buttons might you have on a single screen of your program? Potentially more than one? Might each of those buttons go to a different page? Sure. So we might have 2 or 3 or 4 different segues associated with various buttons on our screen. And all of those guys are going to call this exact same function. So we might need to ask, if this is the segue associated with button 1, we're going to send blah. If this is the segue associated with button 2, we're going to send woot, something like that. All right, so let's look at that. So we'll go ahead and put another button on this screen, this first screen. All right, we're going to label this guy page 2. We're going to label this guy page 3. So page 2, page 3. And we're going to then create another interface controller. Let's just put it there for right now. Let's move these categories down. Oh, that doesn't. And we're going to control click page 3 up to this guy. Again, we'll push it. So that puts that segue in there. I'm going to go ahead and click on that segue so we can give this guy a name. And we're going to call this name page 3. We'll put a capital P. And let's change the other one to have a name of page 2. So this guy's segue is called page 2. This guy's segue is called page 3. We actually had to click on the segues. I had trouble clicking on the first one again because it was separate. So I can move this like this. You notice the screen kind of updates. So now I can click on them cleaner. Or you can just access them over here like we were dealing with last time. So page 3, page 2 for our identifiers. So now when we come into our code here, interface controller, we're printing out the name of the segue identifier and returning blah 100% of the time, regardless of which segue called this guy. But let's just prove that we can see 2 different segue identifiers. All right, so we'll go ahead and hit play. All right, so the first time, page 2 should print out page 2. Then it should print out, I think, here, and then it should print out blah. Because that guy actually has a code behind that's receiving all that stuff, right? So we'll do that. There's page 2, there's here, there's blah. And we'll take advantage of the automatic back button it's given to us because we are pushing it onto our navigation controller. So by pushing it onto the navigation controller, we get a back button. So we'll go back here. Now when I hit page 3, it should just print out page 3, the name of that segue. But I don't have a code behind it the other side. So even though I'm returning blah, there's nothing over there to catch it. So I'm not doing anything with that value. So there's my page 3. Make sense? So I might be interested in differentiating between page 2 and page 3. Maybe I return something different depending on which of those 2 pages I'm going to. Maybe page 2 needs to know about the current user who's logged in, and maybe page 3 needs to know about the current date, something like that. Different pieces of information I might send across. All right, now let's go ahead and look at the little difference between modal and push. So I'll go back to our interface storyboard, and for our page 3 segue, this guy, I'm going to change the segue from being a push to a modal. All right, so he's going to pop up a little differently. And let me go ahead and let's throw a label in that. Well, actually, we'll throw a slider on there just for whatever. That guy has a slider on it. We might not have time to look at it today, but we'll look at sliders at some point. Because remember, all the things we can do, we have to do in terms of the widgets we have access to. So realistically speaking, we're going to spend a lot of our time up front learning about the different widgets and how they work for Apple Watch. Before we do that, we have to kind of know how transitions work. So that's what we're focusing on right now. All right, so we'll go ahead and we're going to hit play. But remember, this guy, our page 3 button, modally presents this interface controller. This guy, page 2 button, pushes this interface controller. So those are our 2 different ways of doing it. All right, so when I hit page 2, it should be just the same as it was before. Slide over, we have our back button. When I hit page 3, slides up, right? It provides us with a cancel button. Make sense? So 2 different approaches, 2 different ways of showing the next screen, both of which might have uses. Make sense? But those are 2 things we have at our disposal, 2 tools we have at our disposal. Okay.
Is it really any different in the back end, like how it's working, or is it just kind of visual?
Well, it is a visual, but it's also what's automated. So if we're using the segues, when we push it, it automatically gives us a go back button. Okay, with I think there's a segue event that we can plug into. Let me look at page 2 real quick. One of the override func. Will disappear. I know this will work. Going bye-bye. I think there might actually be something you can do directly with that back button. So this is in our page 2 Swift. We created a function called will disappear. We're overriding the one that's built in. This is part of that lifecycle, our view controller lifecycle, or our WK interface controller lifecycle that we talked about last time. 2 times ago, actually. I think we quizzed on last time. So as that second screen is disappearing, we should see a going bye-bye. There's our going bye-bye down here. So that was our way to interject something. The question is do I have direct access to let's see, self dot let me let's see here real quick.
And then would you have access to the cancel button as well?
I would assume that if you have access to one, you have access to the other. In fact, let's look at how they do the cancel button. Let's see. WatchKit, modal, cancel button. This is how you change the name of the label. All right, so it's the page itself. So just using this as an example here. If we had made a page 3.swift and it's a init guy, since we're presenting it modally, that guy has a variable called title. So we can set the title. So instead of cancel, we can say close. And that'll change that thing that's in the upper left-hand corner. Here's the awake with context. Let's see. I want to I want to respond to that cancel button being clicked. We already see we can, as that page is going away, which is as a response to the cancel button, we can do something. But what if we want to do something specifically when they hit cancel? It seems to me those might be the exact same event. So it might not make sense for there to be a way to interject. We'll activate. Yeah, it doesn't look like there's a way to directly deal with the cancel button. So at least nothing obvious. Okay. So in any case, if we come back in here, so our last couple minutes here, and we have this guy, this is our page 3. So let's go ahead and let's add a new file. This guy's going to be a watchkit class. He's going to be an instance of WK interface controller. We'll call this guy page 3. We're going to add it to our project. We'll leave it as the default extension. That gets us this. Then just so we don't forget, we need to go make sure we need to let our interface, this guy, know that he is no longer generic. He is now a page 3. All right, so now he's a page 3. We'll go ahead and click on this guy. Well, let's look at this thing right here. This is called a WK interface slider. And we can have a current value, we can have a minimum value and a maximum value. So here, let's make the maximum value 10. And we can say steps by 1, something like that. All right, so we're going to go ahead and run this without actually connecting this in the back end and see that this guy should work, at least visually. We're not responding to his events. We'll mess around with the events next time. So we'll go ahead and go to page 3.
Sliders are only on and off.
Oh, this guy should. Oh, I only have 1 step. That's why. I want this guy to have 10 steps. Value starts at 1, minimum of 0 goes to 10, divide by 10 for the number of steps. Now we should see it in little pieces. Page 3, there's our steps. Make sense? Okay, and what was this guy called? He was called a WK interface slider. So that's what they're calling sliders on here. Probably because this thing doesn't make all that much sense, I guess. But isn't there one of those? I know we're out of time, so you can pack up or whatever. Oh, they call that one a switch. Switch, as opposed to a slider. All right, so we'll mess with this next time, but your homework assignment is up, and your homework assignment deals with having a single second page, taking your current assignment where you press the button a bunch of times to get to a Fibonacci number. When you go to that next page, they'll probably have a second button that takes you to that next page. It passes that number to the next page and displays it on the screen, but not just that number. It's going to make you do a little math on that second page. So it finds the greatest number that evenly divides the Fibonacci number you passed over there. So if you passed over the number 10, well, which isn't it, but you get it, it would give you a 5. The biggest number that evenly divides 10 that's not 10 itself.
Oh, I read
So
that.
just a little mathy crap over on the other side to make sure that you've done the two sides.
That's so much easier. I thought you meant like find the greatest one that's evenly divisible out of like